night, night owls. You're tuned to Midnight FM, where the dark makes room for stories. Tonight, we hand the mic to Grandpa Mr. Joseph for a folk horror tale about music that doesn't just move people, it takes them. He calls it the bone violin. Grandpa, the mic is yours.
Good midnight, Jacob. And to all of you who listen with the lights low, keep your hands still while I speak. The bow can't help but start to move if your fingers dance. There was a man named Elric Dane, a traveling fiddler with shoes that never learned to stay dry, and a laugh that always sounded borrowed. He carried a keys pale as unpainted wood, with brass corners robbed thin by miles. The instrument inside wasn't maple or spruce. It looked like candle wax cured in winter air, veined faintly, smooth as polished ivory. When his bow touched the strings, the sound rose like breath from a sleeping chest. Elric said the violin found him. I asked how an instrument goes hunting, and he smiled the way a gambler smiles at a coin that always lands the wrong way. He told me he'd been sheltering from plague in a town where the doors wore black cloth and broth smelled like fear. The inn had turned into a way station for bad news. Those who stayed 2 nights stayed forever. He slept on the floor under a bed because the bed already had an owner in it. Quiet, cold, unwilling to bargain. In the gray between cough and dawn, he heard a hum from beneath the bed frame. Not a mouse, not a pipe, a note, clear as a throat about to speak. He reached under, felt cloth wrapped around something narrow, and pulled out a case, same pale color as a dying candle. Inside lay the violin. Its bridge was thin as a prayer. The tailpiece bore a line of tiny marks that might have been letters or might have been teeth. The strings were dark, not from rosin, but from whatever the world leaves behind when it refuses to be wiped clean. Elric should have thrown it into the hearth. He tuned it instead. Now a tavern will forgive many crimes if you give it the right melody. He played The Sower's Lament, a tune so old it has moss on it. The bow drew across the strings, and the note didn't start, it arrived already formed, like a traveler who knows the way better than the road. People stopped coughing. Their spoons hung in the air. Scarves were loosened, then clutched again, as if the heart couldn't decide which weather it wanted. Someone at the back began to cry, and no one turned to look because it felt appropriate to weep.
The sound was beautiful, yes, but beauty can be a trapdoor when the hinges are polite. Under the melody, I heard something else, a second voice, too soft to call a harmony, too steady to call an echo. If you've ever heard a shell hold the sea in its throat, you know it, when 2 sounds wear the same coat. After that night, Elric never played wood again. He took the bone-white violin on the road and found that doors learned his name before he knocked. He was invited to supper tables that had never forgiven music for making the poor forget their hunger. People leaned in when he rosined the bow, like watchers at a bedside leaning for a last word. I met him on a market day outside Stonecross. He was buskin' near the well. The coins in his bowl were arranged into neat rows, as though he counted his blessings into factions. He finished a reel and bowed, but his eyes were on the case, not the crowd. The way a man watches a cradle when the wind changes. "Where's your old fiddle?" I asked. He touched the pale one, almost a flinch. He insisted, he said. Elric had a way of speaking that slid around truth like a fish. Still, I liked him. He ate slowly, as if listening while he chewed, and he slept like a person practicing for it. That evening, a steward in black livery rode into town with a summons sealed in wax. His master, Lord Braith, wished for music beautiful enough to wake the dead. The steward spoke as if the world had only one ear and it belonged to his employer. Elric's smile cut itself smaller. He accepted, and because I am a fool for a road I didn't plan, I went along. Braith Hall squatted on its hill like an animal that never learned mercy. The windows were tall, the chimneys older than the roofs, and the family crest showed a hound holding a human hand as if proud of its fetch. Inside the great room, candles huddled into clusters, the wicks leaning toward each other like old women sharing a secret. Behind the high table stood a wall of portraits with eyes that knew how to remember. Lord Braith had the sort of face men get from owning other people's mournings. He clapped once and said, "Play." No request, no tune named, as if asking the weather to rain. Elric tucked the violin against his jaw. The pale wood, if it was wood, didn't gleam under firelight. It absorbed it, like bone will, drinking until the edges disappeared. He drew the bow. The first note loosened the air. The second note made the candles lean. By the third, I felt my hands open without permission, as if the sound was a polite thief to whom the body gladly surrendered its pockets. People smiled in ways they didn't deserve to. Tears moved across the room like swallows at dusk. When Elric slid into a minor run, the violin's undervoice began to rise. It wasn't harmony, it was breath. Quiet sobs braided beneath the tone. I watched Lord Braith. His mouth softened, his eyes unfocused, stared past the bow, past the wall, past the night. He whispered, "Isolde," as a man will whisper a name when he's alone and believes it might do magic or harm. The candles began to bleed wax, thick, perfumed, not white, but a yellow with memory in it. It rolled down the sticks and pooled on the table in slow sighs. Servants shifted but didn't move to catch it. When Elric climbed higher, the pools quivered, then stilled. The portraits on the wall, the men whose eyes had practice, seemed to lean from their frames, as if they might at last learn whether time had forgiven them. I thought, enough for a first tune. But music has no brakes, only hands. Elric's hands trembled, and for the first time I realized he wasn't performing. He was holding on. In the far corner, where the shadows pile up like old coats, something stood. Not a person, not exactly, a shape made of cooler air. You've seen heat make the road wobble in summer. This was the opposite, cold making a standing place for itself. The shape tilted its head the way a listener does when the part they waited for arrives. Elric's bow hair darkened as he played, slickening not from sweat, not from rosin, from something thicker. He winced, changed grip, kept going. That's a musician's pride for you. Better to bleed than to break the line. Then the undervoice opened its mouth fully and became laughter. Not joy. The laughter you hear when someone has finished counting and found the sum to their liking. Several guests went pale. One clutched his chest lightly, more surprised than pained, and sat very gently on the floor, as if he meant to rest only a moment. Lord Braith stood, slammed his fist on the table, and shouted, "Another!" as if thirst and greed had the same mouth. Elric's left hand faltered. He stared at the pale instrument as if it were a letter written by a dead friend and delivered too late. He lowered the bow. The undervoice did not stop. It sang alone. The sound moved through the hall like a draft that knew names. It met the fallen guest and took something invisible. The man sighed, still gentle, and did not sigh again. The laughter in the undervoice changed to murmuring, as if many mouths had sipped at the same cup and pronounced themselves satisfied. Someone screamed. The shape in the corner turned its head toward the sound and then back toward Elric, like a hound who knows which whistle to obey. Elric set the bow down, hands shaking. "I won't," he whispered. "To the violin or to the room, I don't know." The instrument answered, not with words, with a short, impatient chord. The strings played themselves, 4 quick notes in a voice like ice over a river. Lord Braith pointed at Elric as a man points at a fire he believes he can command. "Play, minstrel," he said, "or I will have your hands." Elric lifted the bow again, because that's what fear does. It teaches obedience to the last wrong thing. He began a lament I recognized, "The Road Between." It's a tune you play for the newly dead when you're not sure if the road between here and there has been swept. When he reached the center phrase, the one that remembers the name and forgives it, the undervoice went quiet. The cold shape in the corner leaned like a tree in wind and then wasn't there. The candle straightened. The wax cooled. Lord Braith sat. He was sweating like a man who has carried a coffin he didn't expect to lift again. After, the hall clapped too loudly. Servants cleaned up wax with knives, then with hands when the knives failed. The fallen guest was carried out under a cloth with a pattern that had once meant celebration. Lord Braith pressed a purse on Elric and said nothing else. That's how men speak when they have learned, briefly, that language has sharp edges. We walked out under a sky scoured clean by the music. Elric's breath smoked in the cold, though the night was not so cold. He held the case as if it weighed as much as memory. I had questions. He had none of the answers. "What is it?" I asked. He stared at the case. He said, "It's full." "Of what?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "Of listeners," he said at last, and I felt the hair rise on my arms the way wheat rises when it outgrows the wind. We slept at a wayside inn where the walls had ears and the ears had complaints. In the morning, 2 rooms were empty that had been loud the night before. The innkeeper said their beds were still warm and the blankets smelled like someone had been listening to a lullaby. She said it like an accusation you're not sure where to aim. Elric wouldn't play that day. He wrapped the violin in cloth and kept it at his feet, one hand on the case at all times, like a man riding herd on his last animal. We ate bread, and the crust had the bite of old wood. We drank beer that tasted of regret done wrong. He told me the mark under the tailpiece, those tiny notches, changed after each performance. How many? I asked. He didn't count. He never counted. The wise don't put numbers on what can make a bargain out of a breath. We parted at a crossroad. He went east because the road leaned that way. I went west because I knew a fence that needed mending, and some men are saved by the ordinary duties they can still perform. But the sound of that undervoice nested in my ear and refused to fly out. Years later, because years have the bad habit of occurring, whether invited or not, I heard Elric had been seen near Fairmere, playing in a mill barn during a storm. The roof threshed rain like grain. The crowd pressed close as if they feared an absence would be counted against them. They said he played with his eyes closed, and the bow left streaks on the strings that wouldn't wipe away. They said the candles bled in long ropes, like the hall of a lord who didn't learn enough the first time. They said when lightning struck the pond outside, the water answered the melody by holding its breath. They also said the barn doors stayed shut, though no bar held them. And when the tune ended, the count of heads no longer matched the count of boots. I went looking. I found Elric 3 towns later, sitting on a bridge with his feet dangling over the water like a boy listening to minnows. The case lay open beside him. The violin rested across his knees. He looked thin, not starved, not sick, trimmed, as if someone had carefully taken away everything he didn't need to play. Elric, I said. He glanced up like a man returning from a room no one else can walk in. He said, "Grandpa," using the name strangers give me when they can't think of mine. "You have to stop," I told him. He nodded. He did not stop. That night he played in the church, the pews filled with people who hadn't spoken to one another in months, but now felt the need to share a room just in case their last words required witnesses. The first hymn he stole from the air. The second he stole from the grave. The third he stole from himself. The under voice sang very softly, like a mother calming a child who has already fallen asleep but refuses to admit it.
When he reached the coda, he opened his eyes and looked straight at me. "It won't let go," he said, though his mouth did not move. I rose, set my hand on the pale body, and felt warmth, like a hand heating a stone. Someone shifted beneath that smooth surface. Not wood, Jacob, not bone either. Something that remembered both.
I whispered a prayer Sarala taught us for ending things that do not want to end. The strings sighed. The undervoice paused, as if listening. Then it laughed again. We finished the tune anyway, because dignity matters even to those being devoured. The church emptied with the silence people wear when they've been given more than they asked for and less than they needed. Elric and I sat on the steps with the violin between us like a complicated friend. "Where did it come from?" I asked. He thought for a long time. The moon moved. The dew learned the stairs. "From under a bed," he said finally. "But that's not where it was born." He turned the instrument over. Inside the F-hole, where makers write their names and the year and the city, I saw a dark script that wasn't ink. It looked scratched or gnawed. A list. At least, that's what my eyes called it. Names, many of them. Some crossed out, some half-formed as if written while the hand forgot what writing is. "Are those the dead?" I asked. Elric shook his head. "No," he said, "the listeners." The knight took a deep breath. The violin answered with a small, eager one. And that is where the trouble of this story truly begins. I didn't sleep after that night in the church. Not because of the music, but because of the silence that followed it. You see, silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's what a room does when it's listening to itself breathe. 3 days after that performance, I found Elric again, sitting outside a barn near Fairmere, rein on his shoulders, bow across his lap. He looked thinner than before, as if he'd been carved smaller by every note he'd ever played. The violin lay beside him unwrapped, shining faintly in the stormlight. He looked up at me and said, "It's growing heavier." That night, the villagers insisted on hearing him play. They'd heard rumors of a musician whose music could make the wheat bend and the thunder hesitate. Elric refused at first, then nodded, not because he wanted to, but because something in the case seemed to want it for him. The barn was full. Men, women, children, all waiting, rain hissing against the roof. When Elric opened the case, the lantern light dimmed as if it didn't want to intrude. He tuned the strings slowly. Each note made the air thicken. By the time he raised the bow, I swear the rafters themselves were leaning in. The first note was beautiful. The second was wrong. By the third, I realized the violin wasn't following his hand anymore. It was leading it. Elric's eyes rolled back. The music climbed higher and higher until it didn't sound like sound anymore, more like heat. The walls groaned. The people swayed as if the melody had weight pressing them from every side. And under it all, faintly, I heard that second voice again, the one that wasn't harmony, but hunger. 100 whispers braided together into one breath. Then the lightning struck. It hit the pond outside the barn and lit up the windows. For a second, every shadow inside turned human. and some of the humans turned to shadows. They didn't fall, they just thinned like dust lifted off glass. Faces vanished mid-breath. The sound of clapping hands turned into the sound of dry leaves. When the light faded, half the crowd was gone. The others stood still, blank, eyes wide as if they could still see something no one else could. Elric collapsed. The violin kept playing. No bow, no hand, just that hollow, trembling sound of something too full to stay quiet. I kicked the case shut. The music stopped with a sound like bones cracking. Elric's pulse was weak. His lips moved. I leaned close and heard a whisper. "It's not made of bones, Grandpa. It's made of bodies." Then he went still. I thought he was gone until the violin twitched in the case. The latch snapped open on its own. The lid rose like a breath drawn in. I saw movement under the strings, faint, wet shifting, and something staring back at me from inside the wood. Eyes. Dozens of them, tiny, round, clouded eyes pressed into the grain like trapped bubbles. And then I understood. Every person who ever listened, every voice the violin had ever stolen was still inside it. They weren't gone, they were tuned. The next morning, Elric's body was gone. Just the bow and the violin left behind, lying in the mud. I buried the bow, I burned the case, but the violin wouldn't burn. The flame licked the surface and died, turning cold blue like it was tasting something it couldn't finish. So I carried it to the river, the same one where Elric and I first met. The water didn't take it easily. It floated, resisting, like a lung that refused to drown. When it finally sank, it didn't sink all the way. It hovered just below the surface, strings shivering as if remembering a song. Then the current took it down to the mill where music used to live. I walked away. But even through the trees, I could still hear it, a faint plucking sound like someone counting the names on the inside. That was 30 years ago. And still, on nights when the rain plays its own music, people swear they hear it again. The same soft, beautiful, terrible tune. They call it the bone violin. But I know better. It's still growing, and it's still listening. The years that followed didn't quiet it. They only made the silence around it more patient. People forgot Elric Dane, but they remembered the tune. Every few seasons, someone new would hum a fragment of it. A farmer threshing wheat, a mother rocking her child, and they'd say, "It just came to me." It never just comes, not when a song has teeth. One autumn, a letter arrived. No sender, just my name and a single sentence. The river has given it back. I knew which river, and I knew what it was. When I reached the banks near Fairmere, the water looked wrong, still, too clear, as if something beneath it were watching upward. And there it was, resting against a pile of stones like driftwood that refused to float away. The violin. It was cleaner than it had any right to be. No rot, no damage, just smooth, pale, perfect bone. But when I stepped closer, I saw what had changed. Across its back, where varnish should have been, were rows of carved names. Hundreds, maybe thousands, each one perfectly engraved, and every few inches a name I recognized from the missing and the dead. And near the bottom, almost too small to read, was the newest one, Elric Dane. I kneeled down beside it. The air was colder there. My breath fogged and didn't drift away. It stayed, hanging in front of my face like it wanted to listen. I picked up the violin. It was warm. The strings trembled without touch. The bridge pulsed faintly, as if something beneath it still had a heartbeat. And then I heard it. Faint music, like a bow drawn across a single open string. Except there was no bow, no hand, just the wind. The note grew louder until it was no longer a note at all, but a chorus. Hundreds of voices inside the wood, men, women, children, some crying, some laughing, all of them whispering the same word, play. I wanted to drop it, but the thing clung to my fingers, slick and warm, as though the neck were alive. I shouted, "No!" and the chorus answered the way an echo answers in a cave, not later, but deeper. Play, Joseph. I'd never given it my name. It already knew. The sound grew sharper. Now I could hear my own voice joining the others, though my lips weren't moving. Every secret I'd ever spoken aloud to the earth came back to me through those strings.
I stumbled back, slipped on the wet stones, fell into the river. The violin fell too, but it didn't sink. It hovered just beneath the surface, strings still trembling, eyes still open inside the grain. It said, "One last song," not in words, but in the rhythm of its vibration. The water around it began to glow, and inside the glow I saw them, faces, pale and calm, drifting like leaves. Elric's among them, his mouth still shaping a melody the world wasn't supposed to hear. Then the violin split. Not cracked, opened. From the seam, a dark mist poured out, thick as breath, heavy as regret. It spread across the riverbank and into the trees, and as it passed, everything it touched fell quiet. No birds, no wind, no frogs, just that low, endless hum, the sound of the dead listening. I crawled to the edge, coughing river water and fear. When the mist cleared, the violin was gone. Only one thing remained, a small chip of bone, the size of a finger joint, floating on the surface. I picked it up. It was warm, still beating. I threw it as far as I could. It didn't make a splash. It sang. That was years ago. But I still hear the music sometimes, faint, behind the walls, or in the hum of an empty room. I don't think the violin died. I think it changed shape. Maybe it found another instrument. Maybe it found another player. Maybe it's just waiting for one of you to hum the wrong tune and let it in again.
Good midnight, night owls. That was Grandpa Mr. Joseph sharing a story I don't think I'll ever forget. Somewhere out there, a violin might still be playing. One you don't see, but hear when you think you're alone. If you ever do, don't hum along. Music that comes back to you without a source isn't echo. It's invitation. This is R.J. Jacob, signing off from Midnight FM. Sleep lightly tonight, and listen carefully, because sometimes what you hear humming in the dark isn't the wind. Good midnight.